India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is travelling to Italy to participate in the G7 outreach summit. In his departure statement, Prime Minister Modi said, and I quote, "I'm travelling to Apulia region in Italy to participate in the G7 outreach summit on 14th of June 2024. I'm glad that my first visit in the third consecutive term is to Italy for the G7 summit. I warmly recall my visit to Italy for the G20 summit in 2021. Prime Minister Meloni's two visits to India last year were instrumental in infusing momentum and depth in our bilateral agenda. We remain committed to consolidate the India-Italy strategic partnership and bolster cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and the Mediterranean region." During the discussions at the outreach session, the focus would be on artificial intelligence, energy, Africa and the Mediterranean. It will be an opportunity to bring greater synergy between the outcomes of the G20 summit held under India's presidency and the forthcoming G7 summit. I'm also looking forward to meeting other leaders participating in the summit, unquote. And from the Russia-Ukraine conflict to climate change, the G7 leaders are discussing a range of global issues as they converge in Italy. Representatives from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK and US will also discuss issues including the wars in Ukraine and Gaza conflict. We have more in this report.
It was all smiles and handshakes as the Group of Seven or the G7 summit began in Italy. Light moments aside, the leaders of the G7 nations, US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan have several crucial agendas on their plate. On top of the list are the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the West Asia crisis. The group's leaders have agreed on a deal to give $50 billion in loan to Ukraine using interest from frozen Russian sovereign assets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is also participating in the meet. US President Joe Biden has been urging fellow leaders to push Hamas to accept a Washington-backed ceasefire deal. Growing economic threat from China, the Indo-Pacific and artificial intelligence are also among the key areas on focus. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said that G7 also seeks to bolster its ties with the global South.
The message we want to convey is a G7 that, under the Italian presidency, wants to strengthen its dialogue with the nations of the Global South. We have done this because this land is historically a bridge between West and East.
The summit comes at a time when G7 leaders have been battling domestic issues. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's parties trailed behind the far right in the recently held EU elections, prompting Macron to call for snap elections. While in the UK, opinion polls are showing that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives will lose the upcoming general elections to the Labour Party. Bureau Report, DD India.
And we're very glad to have DD India's Giles Gibson joining us live from Bari in Italy for more. Giles, first of all, the timings amidst the significant international events. We're looking at war in Ukraine, Gaza conflict and Europe experiencing a sort of political churn with major EU elections there, US, UK polls, all of that.
Absolutely. If you look at the list of leaders who've flown in here to southern Italy, you might think that for some of them this is a little bit of a holiday or at least a respite from the domestic situation in their countries, because of course you have Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, who is way behind the opposition Labour Party in the polls for the upcoming general election there on the 4th of July. You have Emmanuel Macron, the French President, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, both recovering from some very damaging European election results for their respective parties, and the French President also deciding to call snap elections coming up in just a couple of weeks' time. You also, though, do have the host, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, in kind of the opposite position, because her Brothers of Italy party had a very strong showing in the European elections just in the last few days, her party topping the polls here in Italy. And this is also the culmination, really, the sort of biggest moment of the Italian G7 presidency, the moment when leaders such as India's Narendra Modi, the US President Joe Biden, some of the most important people in the world converge on southern Italy for this summit, although of course that does also bring a certain amount of pressure for Giorgia Meloni, because the success of her country's G7 presidency really will be judged on what she can get these leaders to agree to in the final statement at the end of this summit.
At least the opening has been made by the signing of agreement, a big loan corpus to Ukraine, and we have seen Zelensky's visuals, Meloni welcoming him. So this Russia-Ukraine conflict in all likelihood is going to dominate the proceedings. There's going to be a lot of talk about freezing Russian assets and much more.
Well, I think we need to be a little bit careful here. We've not actually had official confirmation of this political agreement about issuing that $50 billion loan to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets as collateral. But we are hearing reports that a political deal has been done between the leaders here in southern Italy for those funds to be released. We've been hearing from a French official who spoke anonymously saying that the funds will be released by the end of 2024. The US National Security Advisor also making similar noises. So it looks like a deal has been done, but we are still waiting to see the final statement and indeed exactly how the technical details will be ironed out in the coming weeks.
Okay, we'll not jump the gun, we'll wait and watch. But also, this particular G7 summit has seen an unprecedented expanded guest list, you would agree. There are 12 countries on the list. The number has actually, increased if you compare them to the previous two editions. And also 5 international organizations are participating. And first-time leaders from Saudi Arabia will also be invited, or they have already been invited to the G7 summit.
Yeah, we saw Giorgia Meloni at the start of the day one of this summit really giving her opinion about how the G7 should be an open organization rather than a kind of closed shop of some of the world's largest economies and democracies in the West. She talked about how she didn't want the G7 to be a fortress. She wanted it to open up to the rest of the world. And we are seeing that certainly in terms of the guest list here, with all sorts of international leaders from outside of the G7 invited, including the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Brazilian President Lula da Silva. Pope Francis is coming down from the Vatican, not too far a trip down to southern Italy to take part in a session on artificial intelligence. So yeah, a really packed guest list, which we'll see really on day 2 of the summit, when a lot of those guests will be taking part in some of the sort of outer sessions of this
particular attention, you would agree, has been paid to the African grouping of nations and Indo-Pacific this time around.
Yeah, we've seen the head of the African Union invited to this summit, as well as some other leaders from the global south, and that really reflects, I think, the Meloni government's foreign policy as Italy itself, because we've seen, for example, in the last 6 months or so, the Italian government announcing its Italy-Africa plan. It's known as the Mattei plan. It's really a proposal for Italy to engage much more with its neighbours to the south across the Mediterranean Sea. We've also seen Giorgia Meloni alongside the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen making deals with countries in northern Africa as well, such as Tunisia, to try to slow down the numbers of small boats crossing the Mediterranean, carrying people who are trying to claim asylum in Italy and therefore in the European Union. So yes, this outreach to Africa as a continent is very much in line with the Meloni government's foreign policy as well.
Okay. All right. Also, if you talk a bit about the broader agenda besides the conflict that will also, dominate the conversations. There's going to be a lot of talk about climate and energy, and particularly migration, because these are the areas of interest, particularly for the host nation as well.
Yeah, so the actual first session of the first day, so several hours ago, covered Africa as well as climate change and development. Much of the afternoon has been dominated by those talks around the war in Ukraine and trying to boost support for the Ukrainians as their fight against the full-scale Russian invasion continues. I think the focus on day 2 is going to shift to the Indo-Pacific, and in particular we're expecting to see some pretty in-depth talks about the Chinese economy. The G7 have for some time now been saying that they have very serious concerns about what they describe as industrial overcapacity from China and its impact on Western economies. So look out for, in the final statement, some strong messaging, some strong warnings from the G7 about what they see as Chinese overcapacity.
Yes, and expansionism by China. Thank you very much, Giles Gibson, for joining us live from picturesque Bari in Italy. Thank you. And let me quickly go live across to my, thank you Giles, and let me quickly go live across to my colleague Amritpal, who also joins us live from the very summit of, the venue of the summit. Amrit, over to you now. Departure statement has set the agenda, what India brings to the table, consolidation of relationship as far as India-Italy strategic partnership already is concerned, but specific focus on Indo-Pacific and Mediterranean.
Yes, the Prime Minister in his pre-departure statement did mention that Mediterranean and African cooperation in the Mediterranean and cooperation with the African continent would be discussed at length in the outreach sessions. When he talked about cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, he talked in the context of the bilateral relationship with Italy, that this will figure in the talks. He gave an indication that this could figure in the talks with Prime Minister Meloni, on whose invitation Prime Minister Modi is coming here. So there are two aspects. If we look at the India story, there are two aspects to the visit. One, the bilateral aspect in which he meets Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, and also other G7 leaders and partner countries leaders, which include the French President Emmanuel Macron. It includes President Zelensky. It includes the meeting with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And then there is of course, the multilateral aspect for which he's coming, the outreach session on which, he mentioned that he could touch upon artificial intelligence, cooperation in Mediterranean and Africa, energy security. The Foreign Secretary yesterday in his briefing had said that the Prime Minister could talk about counterterrorism and the need for the world to take a united stand on that. So that's the whole milieu of the one-day visit of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, if you could just also elaborate a bit on India agenda in these outreach sessions, considering what the other G7 members would look up to India as a leader of the global south. So how significant is that going to be?
I think Prime Minister's address would be largely focused on the needs, concerns and aspirations of the global south. As India has become the undeclared leader of the global south, essentially putting the trust on, that the...
Okay, I think we will try and get back to Amrit maybe in a while, because he's joining us live from Italy. Those are the visuals of earlier Prime Minister when he departed for Italy to participate in the G7 summit hosted by Italy this time around, when multiple crises are unfolding worldwide. In the departure statement, Prime Minister reiterated. Amritpal is with me, and let me quickly go back to Amritpal to talk more about, yes, Amritpal, I think you're there with us. You were telling us about the expectations as far as Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the issues he's going to basically pick up in the outreach summit, and what makes that very significant?
The voice of the global south would be, strongly put across by the Prime Minister. He would use this forum to, convey to the G7 and the larger world from this forum, unless the world factors in the needs and concerns of the global inclusive and, factor them in the global governance architecture, the world can't really find solutions to the challenges being faced by the world collectively today, be it climate change, be it development, be it energy security, be it food security. So, the global south has to be an important stakeholder in this whole exercise. Now, the second thing that the Prime Minister could, thrust upon, could stress upon is that what was agreed at New Delhi during the G20 that India hosted. The New Delhi's declaration very clearly put out the agenda of the Global South and sought the cooperation and participation of the G7, because the G7 is also a member of the of the G20.
Correct.
So, these leaders, because the partner countries are mostly from the developing world, be it Asia, from where India is there, then there is Brazil from South America, there are countries from Africa, there are 12 countries that have been invited. In fact, more countries than the G7 countries
And
itself,
Arab leadership also.
Countries. The Arab League. Absolutely, the Arab League as well.
Yes.
So, so bringing a certain amount of continuity, a certain amount of synergy between what was agreed in New Delhi and what the G7 decides at Borgo in Asia.
Okay, all right. Amrit, as of now, many thanks for joining us live from Italy and putting this in larger perspective. Thank you.